Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour. Sarah and I have just been discussing maybe rebranding the whole concept of Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour, because Sarah's pointed out to me that what is very, very good for doing Zoom links is a rocking chair, which she's acquired. So I was thinking maybe we could call it Off Our Rockers or something. Sarah, do you think that might be a good idea?
Or maybe Psy Rockers.
Psy Rockers.
Yeah, I'm more into psychedelic rock than just general rocking chair use. But yeah, I thoroughly recommend getting a rocking chair for Zoom things, because I do quite a lot of long Zoom sessions with Explorers Club and this obviously as well. And it's very comfortable piece of furniture to Zoom on.
Right, it shows how we're getting older, maybe, the idea of rocking chairs and everything, or it could be going back to our childhood, couldn't it, really? Right, okay, I'm delighted today to introduce today's guest, which is Robert Filocco, who contacted me on Facebook a few months ago, asking my interest in the work of Rudolf Steiner. And Steiner is somebody that has fascinated me for many years. And Robert then intrigued me with some of the points he was making regarding Steiner and the UFO idea, abduction ideas, and various other things. So we were very keen to get Robert on board to have an informal discussion about this. Now, one of our previous guests, Gary Lachman, is somebody who's actually written a book on Steiner as well. So it'd be very interesting to compare and contrast these two areas. But just to tell you a little bit about Robert, and of course I will be reading this as well, so it's not my own words, so I'm reading it, but I'll try and give it a kind of an intonation and things, because funnily enough, 2 weeks ago I was in the studios recording the audible version of my forthcoming book. So maybe I should be able to do this with the right kind of cadence, but let's see. Okay. After completing advanced studies in psychology, Robert has worked in the field of mental health since 1986, most recently in private practice. He has served as an adjunct professor of psychology at several universities and colleges. Since his youth, he has pursued interests in the paranormal, especially UFOs, publishing in the Bulletin of Anomalous Experience, Outer Limits magazine, and related journals. He's also a children's book author. Most recently, he has pursued in-depth reading and study of Rudolf Steiner leading up to his recent piece, Steiner, Ahriman and UFOs, serving as the basis for the conference presentation, which was entitled Steiner's Relevance to the UFO Challenge. Robert, welcome to the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour.
Thank you, Anthony.
Right, okay, well, let's move straight. No, let's not do that. I think for a start off, I'm interested in why you have this interest both in Steiner and the UFO phenomenon as well, because it is comparatively unusual for a professional psychologist to be involved in these things. I know there's been various psychologists throughout the years, like Mac and various other people, but it's very intriguing as to why it is that you are interested in the phenomenon. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Well, my interest in UFOs predated, my work as a psychotherapist, my academic training and such. I had an experience when I was about 9 years old of visitations over a period of about 3 weeks. Very frightening time. I was about eight years old at that time, and I had mantid beings that came into my bedroom, sort of in a classic experience or kind of scenario. And the experience that I had was pretty profound. I had an experience of some sort of download or input, which is a typical experiencer aspect. I had visions of ecological disaster, of the nuclear war, all of which was pretty frightening for an 8-year-old. Previous to that, I had no real fears. I had no trouble sleeping, nothing of that nature. I don't have sleep paralysis. I don't have any other clinical condition that would explain the experience. And I obviously couldn't make sense of it in 1967 when the literature started coming out in the 80s with Hopkins and Jacobs and those folks. I began to put it together that this fit into that mold. So it was a little bit later that I really put that experience in perspective. Unlike other experiencers, I haven't had any follow-up with that. I haven't had any further visitations. I've had other experiences, mystical experiences, I guess you could say, pretty intense spiritual experiences, but nothing really of that nature. So my case is a little bit different. There are people who have had sort of a one-off type of experience. Most people seem to have been followed over time. So I can't say I have, that aspect. So that always, maybe that's at some unconscious, subconscious level interested me in UFOs, but I was always interested from a young age in the paranormal. Shortly after I had that experience, I came across a book in my little elementary school on karma and reincarnation, which is a major interest of mine, major interest of Steiner. And I became intrigued with Eastern philosophy, with the paranormal. Did some research, jumping ahead a little bit. I did some research in college. I actually did an independent study with a wonderful old eccentric anthropology professor, Roger Westcott, and wrote about a 260 page independent study, basically a book connecting the ancient alien theories with UFOs, which oddly enough really wasn't done much then. The title of it was The Monitors, which is very similar to The Watchers. And the theme was that there has been, over a period of time, numerous examples of interaction with beings outside of our ecology. They're variously characterized in the shamanic literature and the UFO literature. I kind of coined the term Exo Ecology to explain or to sort of create I was hoping to sort of create a new discipline where the nature of these beings and their interactions is discussed and understood, kind of building on the shamanic traditions in a more modern way. I think after that, I got more involved in just more formal academic studies. I initially studied experimental psychology. I was preparing to be a research psychologist, but I got more interested in working with people. And there's a whole backstory to that. But then I got into that field, and I've been working in the field of mental health since 1986. Along the way, I've had some other interesting experiences of glimpses into past lives, which I think would be of interest to you. And prophetic dreams, things of that nature. I've had a meditation discipline for a long period of time in my life. And along the way, you have those kinds of experiences that do pop up. So maybe if it's relevant, I can discuss them. I wouldn't say they're terribly unusual for anyone on that kind of path. So the UFO phenomena, Jacques Vallée and John Keel were the authors that I really gravitated to. And I never really believed in the extraterrestrial hypothesis as being really explanatory. Those and Gordon Creighton from the Flying Saucer magazine. Those were the people that I tended to read and invest the most faith in. I wrote a brief piece on linking the UFO phenomena with Gurdjieff's work in the Bulletin of Anomalous Experience in 1994. And then I kind of, got away from any formal research on the paranormal. About 10, 12 years ago, I started reading Rudolf Steiner. And I had wanted to pursue a study of Steiner for a long period of time. And I finally became kind of hooked on his books. Initially, I read books more about his spiritual ecology and elementals and their connection with nature, and his book on bees. Later, I became interested in his cosmology and the role of various beings in the evolution of man. And I think the tie-in really was in seeing a lot of his speculations about the future evolution of man in the context of the UFO phenomena, which I think is linked to different possibilities or different timelines for human evolution. And I guess we can get into that in a little bit more detail. But that's kind of a thumbnail sketch of kind of where I've come from. Steiner intrigues me because, a number of different reasons. One is his prediction concern about the development of what we now call artificial intelligence, and the idea that at some point we would be heading towards, or one of our timelines or one of our destinies could be heading towards a linkage with machine intelligence, which he died in 1925. So, that was very crude at that time, but a linkage which could entrap human consciousness. He was very concerned about that. He also was concerned about what we would now call transhumanism, the idea that there would be a kind of Darwinian or eugenics kind of genetic manipulation of mankind. There's various allusions to that in his works. So he was very prescient, I think, about the challenges that we're facing now in terms of transhumanism and artificial intelligence. That kind of that hooked me into reading more about him, reading more about his cosmology, and the role of specific beings like Ahriman, Lucifer. Steiner's interesting in that he was trained as an engineer and a scientist. He was very up to date in the science of his time, but he also carried with him a more traditional theological metaphysics, and that he was part of the Rosicrucian traditions, and so he carried that into his work. So you have this man who seemed to be very prescient about the development of modern society, and again, artificial intelligence, the dangers of relying too much on computers, and this very traditional or more traditional Christian metaphysics. So I rambled a little bit there, but I hope that kind of gives you a little bit of a background.
No, absolutely. That was quite fascinating and intriguing on so many levels, because, as you know, this is very much an area of my interest, and my book, The Hidden Universe, very much plays on the ideas of exactly what are the alien intelligences that we seem to interface with. And the simplistic answer, the simplistic model that it's just the extraterrestrial hypothesis, which you mentioned there. And rather like yourself as well, I was heavily influenced by Crichton. I was very influenced by Jacques Vallée, and various other writers that were very much taking the aspects of John Keel as classic example as well, writers that were taking a very different approach to the whole UFO phenomenon, saying that it goes back deep into the distant areas of time, and there's a linkage between what we regularly call elementals. But what I'd like to do very much, because I'm very intrigued by this, and I know this is an area that interests a lot of the people that are involved in my groups, and it is the idea, and again, in my book, The Hidden Universe, the first section is about elemental encounters and encounters with non-ordinary intelligences, non-human intelligences. And I'm particularly fascinated by your experience as an 8-year-old and what exactly was taking place there. Can you give us a little bit more information about your experience there? And particularly, did the mantids communicate with you? And what subsequently, how do you then analyze this with your psychological training and your background? How do you analyze that now?
Well, I don't think there's any explanation in terms of modern psychology. I've come to think that experiences are being initiated. It's really more of an initiation. We don't have the mystery schools that we used to have. We don't have the formal institutions of spirituality that we used to have. So I think that part of the experience is a form of initiation. I think that there are so-called negative or dark forces involved in this, as well as forces that are trying to help mankind, which kind of fits into Steiner's cosmology. It's almost like a Tolkien-esque aspect to it. So I see it more from the perspective of my readings in esoteric traditions, much more so than modern psychology. There are a lot of experiences that people have in sleep paralysis and hypnagogic states, which I think tune into other dimensions of existence. So I don't reduce them to some sort of psychological explanation. Now, in my practice, I don't advertise as someone who is actively recruiting people who have had paranormal experiences. I have what you could call a pretty traditional practice, and I enjoy it very much. But I have run into quite a few people, who have spontaneously reported religious experiences, mystical experiences, paranormal experiences. I think they're more common with people who are typically diagnosed with ADHD, OCD. I work a lot with those populations. They tend to be very empathic people. They tend to be very creative people. They tend to be able to tune into other dimensions a little bit more easily than other people, I suppose. So I think that there's a bit of a tie-in there. I don't know if you're familiar with Mary Rodwell's work.
I am, yes. I met Mary. I did an event with Mary in Australia a few years ago.
Yeah, some of what I found kind of ties in with her work. Now, again, she's more focused on that population exclusively. But I find that I think her work is important and pretty valid in terms of the development of this new human. Tying it in with Steiner, he talked about how there's different stages of human evolution, and we're evolving ideally to a state where we're all empaths, where we're all connected. Our consciousnesses are connected. We have this sort of collective unconscious that's operating. And he talked about how at some point in human evolution, if things go well, we'll feel each other's emotions, we'll feel each other's pain. We're connected in kind of what I call an organic singularity. And there's a contrast with this artificial singularity, which is being pushed in artificial intelligence circles, and which Steiner ties in with the machinations of Ahriman, who is one of the adversaries, or one of the beings of hindrance that human beings have encountered. Again, he
that's very much Zoroastrian, as I recall.
Yeah, the origins of the name Ahriman are from Zoroastrianism. He used that term. Ahriman was the equivalent of Satan in the older metaphysical theological literature for the Rosicrucians and for Steiner. Steiner is very much from the Rosicrucian tradition. And you have Lucifer, who has his own role, and of course you have Christ, who is the major figure. Steiner had his own kind of esoteric Christianity, which was central to his anthroposophy.
Well, that's how you pronounce it. I've always wondered. I always avoid saying it because I always confuse it with theosophy and everything else as well. So thank you for that. I'll still get it wrong, but pray go on.
Well, again, as far as the evolution of man, I think that there is something to the whole idea of advanced beings, more advanced spiritual beings incarnating at this time. And we can maybe talk about reincarnation and karma. You have your own kind of take on that, which maybe we can discuss. But I think that there's something to that, based on the people that I see, based upon the increase of people who are reporting paranormal experiences, telepathy, precognition, things of that nature. I think that there's a corresponding kind of push to limit what I call this organic singularity that's developing, by trying to push us towards more of an artificial intelligence, where machines develop but humans don't, where instead of years of practice and meditation, spiritual discipline, we're given these enhanced bodies, these enhanced neural networks that we're connected to. I think that's a very dangerous path that we could go on. And that is a timeline that Steiner talked about as sort of the opposite of that empathic timeline, or the development of the empathic human collective consciousness, one in which we're trapped in this kind of automatic thinking, where feeling is and human connection is no longer important, where we become very machine-like, which to me is I think is a pretty stark timeline, or stark possibility. And tying it in with the elementals, Keel talked very vaguely about elementals, ultra-terrestrials. Vallée had some studies in esoteric, some esoteric studies, but didn't get really heavily into that. He's very much a rationalist. The Passport to Magonia was a wonderful book that tied in, fairy lore, tied in older traditions, and that's a seminal work. But he never really delved too much into the occult, so to speak. J. Allen Hynek, on the other hand, was a reader of Steiner. I don't know if you're aware of that.
I was not aware that Hynek was involved with Steiner. That's quite interesting. Okay, tell me more.
Yeah, Hynek studied Rosicrucianism.
Can we just explain, just for the people who are not necessarily into ufology in any way, could you just explain who J. Edgar Hynek was? J. Edgar Hoover Hynek was.
Yeah, Hoover was another character. But anyway, J. Allen Hynek was part of the Project Blue Book. And he actually was initially known for the whole swamp gas explanation. Later, he became believer in the existence of the UFO phenomena, and tried to study it scientifically, as did Vallée. But both of them eventually got swept up into seeing the more paranormal aspects of it. And he, from an early age, was a reader of Rudolf Steiner. He, if you read Vallée's journals, he mentions that a couple of times, that he inherited Hynek's library when he passed. And he had 2 volumes of How to Know Higher Worlds by Steiner that were extensively annotated, and he believed that there was a connection between Steiner's thought that there were beings coming into this world and interacting with us, and the UFO phenomenon. So that's a little bit of a sidelight, but what I do in my writings is explore that in more depth. Like what are elementals? Steiner talked about beings that were Ahrimanic beings that were incredibly intelligent, very technologically advanced, but lacking in human feeling, lacking human Gemut, I think is the German term for it, which has a lot of feeling tones and connotations to it. But they were lacking in that kind of human connection, that human warmth. And that's what's described in a lot of the UFO literature. You also have the elementals, like the grays, fit the traditional esoteric description. You see them in a variety of different literature. In the Skoll report, right, with blue.
Yeah, with blue, exactly. Yeah, blue was particularly intriguing, wasn't it? By the way, I heard that Mr. Foy died yesterday. Apparently, one of the guys that was involved in Skoll.
I didn't know that. No.
Yeah, literally, it was just breaking news this morning.
That I didn't know.
Okay.
Well, that's one manifestation. The experience that your mother had of a gray, fits the description of an elemental. You have like Marco Pogachnik and some other people who've done work on elementals, and their descriptions of a gnome, which is an extremely intelligent but very kind of cold-hearted being, fits the description of grays. So one thing I speculate about is that elementals have been kind of they're on the lower hierarchy of beings that are involved in the UFO phenomena. You have the mantid beings, you have sometimes human beings or humanoid forms who seem to use the grays as to perform tasks. They use them to for instance, in some like the medical experimentation that's talked about in the abduction literature or the experiencer literature, they tend to be the worker bees, and there tends to be a higher intelligence that's operating them, which fits in again with elementals. Elementals, according to esoteric literature, were created by higher beings that sacrificed a part of themselves, and that's how elementals were created. It's almost like tulpas. Which brings us to kind of the mind is the builder kind of view of how life is created. And it's just intriguing to me that there's these similarities between the elemental beings that were described by Steiner and described in occult literature and the grays. The mantid beings, and there wasn't much written about them until maybe 20 years after I had that experience, tend to be viewed as benevolent and viewed as healing beings and beings of a higher intelligence. And there's a lot of speculation about where these beings come from. Do they come from our physical plane? Are they ETs in the traditional sense? Are they interdimensional beings? I think that's kind of a moot point. I'm really more concerned and more interested in what their various agendas are. And that's something ufologists struggle with. Who are these intelligences? Why are they here? And I think Steiner provides a cosmology to explain a lot of what's going on.
Okay, can you tell us about that then, please? Now, first, before we go on, if you could actually explain who Rudolf Steiner was, a little bit about background of that, and then explain his cosmology and how it fits.
Well, Steiner, it's hard to encapsulate him because he was involved in so many different things. But he grew up in the late 19th century. He was born in Austria. He seems to have been a clairvoyant from a young age. He had a lot of spiritual experiences. He saw an aunt of his that had passed away when he was quite young. He saw her ghost or her presence. He was interested in these kinds of experiences from a young age, but he went into a very traditional path of education where he was trained as from the scientific method. He was trained as an engineer. Later, he got involved with theosophy and later split off and formed his own movement called anthroposophy. He's connected to the Waldorf schools, which I think some people are familiar with, the Camp Hill movement, which works with the disabled. He was a major, anthroposophy was a major force behind organic farming, biodynamic agriculture. So he was very creative in a lot of different ways. He was a very creative artist. And the Gathenium in Switzerland is kind of a marvel of architecture that he designed. So he was very much a polymath, very much a Renaissance man. But his major work was focused on battling materialism. Materialism, technology, misused technology. That was one of the things that he felt that he had to combat, and that anthroposophy was designed to combat through various forms of artistic and creative expression. In particular, he was very much interested in Christian metaphysics. He seems to have had some experience, which he called the mystery of Golgotha, where he viewed he clairvoyantly viewed the death of Christ, and the death of Christ was, according to him, a major event in the evolution of mankind, and that the Christ sacrifice opened up opened the doors to a spiritual evolution of man. And there's a lot of detail I can go in there, but for the sake of brevity, I think it's important also to note that he felt that his major role, at least initially, was to reintroduce the ideas of karma and reincarnation to the West. And he wrote a 8-volume series on karmic relationships, which I'm up to volume 8. I'm almost done with that, which was one of his major works. So it's hard to encapsulate all of what he did. He was a major influence on a lot of thinkers. Tarnas, who wrote Psyche and Cosmos, credits his inspiration to Steiner. Much like Gurdjieff, he was an underground influence in a lot of different thinkers, philosophers.
That's interesting. So, Sarah, you mentioned that you've been interested in Steiner for some time. So, would you like to come in with any comments or questions yourself at the moment?
Well, I do love Steiner. I haven't researched him as thoroughly as you have, but I have enjoyed quite a lot of his books, and especially Knowledge of the Higher Worlds. When I first read that book feels like an initiation and inspired me to write my book, actually, because the format had this idea of like taking the reader on this spiritual journey. And one of the things I was thinking about when you were talking about him was his knowledge of the very ancient wisdom literature. A lot of what you're talking about really reminds me of Mesopotamian ideas about astral deities. And he mentions, because he has a kind of a branch of anthroposophy, astrosophy, which is his approach to astrology, which he believed that the stars influenced humanity, but they didn't dictate your destiny in the way sort of modern astrologers might think. And this, when he talks about it in the same way that the Mesopotamians talk about it, as the heavens being the writing, the stars being the writing of heaven, and that within the writing of heaven you can work out what things are going to take place on Earth, and how certain people are going to manifest on Earth. You know, this idea that he had of people being reincarnations of certain kind of strong characters. And also in the Mesopotamian literature, and obviously that filters into Egyptian and then later Greek and Roman, is this idea of demonic or angelic presences. So this idea that there are these spirits, and they have a lot of similarities with ideas of UFOs and things like that as well, especially the demons, because they tend to travel on winds, and they're associated with kind of etheric forms, like psychic forms. So I was wondering what you think about that, like how much access would Rudolf Steiner have had to these very ancient texts, which do lay down a lot of these ideas?
Well, I think he was a reader of a lot of those texts. And again, a lot of those texts are, a lot of the content comes through the Rosicrucian tradition, where he claims to have been initiated. There's a wonderful book called The Zelator. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's edited by David Ovison, and it's about a Rosicrucian initiate. And there's a lot of content in that book that ties in ancient traditions and the Rosicrucian tradition. Steiner, in his writings, alludes to that, touches on that here and there. He never wrote volumes just about that. That really wasn't his. That wasn't his task, or wasn't his interest so much. But he was, he's definitely tied in with that. You mentioned, etheric physics.
I do love Steiner because his writing is very poetic, and I think that because his writing is so poetic, it especially kind of engages the senses. So I've always enjoyed reading his books. Mike asked, how do your colleagues respond to your interest in these areas, or do you keep it quiet?
Do I keep it quiet? Yeah, I guess I tend to. It's only been the last couple of years that I've been doing podcasts. I've written a couple of articles. I've connected with MISTech, which is a group in Seattle, and they're connected to anthroposophy. They're connected to Steiner's traditions, and they're trying to develop what they call a moral technology, or what Steiner called mechanical occultism. The idea that through moral development and a spiritual path, we can begin to operate machines, and we can operate machines based on our guidelines, based upon our initiative, our intentions, versus being, again, kind of locked into this automatic singularity of artificial intelligence. So that's, I've really connected more with the anthroposophical community around my interests. Again, my work with people with called the alphabet diagnoses, ADHD, OCD, some autistic folks, is a window into a connection with the paranormal. But it's not something that I haven't written a book about it, or maybe at some point I'll write a book, but I haven't come out, so to speak, within the community. I have a one-person private practice, so I tend to do my own thing.
That's going to be very interesting to link in with this, basically because a future guest is going to be Olga Bogner-Deshina, who is one of the major writers on the more esoteric aspects of autism and the way in which certain people on the autistic spectrum self-evidently have psychic abilities of one description or another. And of course, I feature that in my book, Opening the Doors of Perception. So I'm very interested in pursuing that a little bit more about your opinions regarding autism, particularly because a previous guest of this show is a guy called Ed Gilchrist, whose son has been manifesting for many, many years, who's severely autistic, but has been manifesting precognitive skills and various other uncanny abilities that are virtually inexplicable by modern science. So I'd be interested to pursue that a little bit more with you as well.
I think that there are a lot of individuals out there who are manifesting in that way. And I think that that's part of human evolution. It's part of the creation of, or moving towards, what Steiner called a more positive timeline of developing this empathic, organically connected community. There's a lot of overlap. If you kind of can go back to your high school Venn diagrams, there's a lot of overlap between ADHD, OCD, and autism. I just see them as one spectrum, with various features, different manifestations depending upon the person. But emotional sensitivity, empathy is something that is pretty much always present, with people who have those, DSM-5 diagnosis. I'm not big on the diagnostic codes. I think they're just markers. They're just descriptors, by the way. I also don't think they're ADHD or OCD is a disorder. I think it's a different way of experiencing the world, different way of processing information, a different way of sensing things. And I do think that there's much more of a window into alternate realities, into these higher mental, spiritual faculties that's opened up when you have these conditions. Epilepsy is another one. And I think you've written about that in some of your books, with temporal lobe epilepsy, various forms of epilepsy that open people up into, open windows into other dimensions of reality.
Yeah, because it's all very intriguing, isn't it? It just seems that the old Henri Bergson argument of the brain acting as an attenuator, it seems that whatever takes place during these conditions, I even hate using the term conditions, and I always like to use the term people experience these things rather than they're an integral part of themselves. But it seems that these conditions override the brain's ability to stop us perceiving the greater world. And on this, I think it's Markham, is it, that has the model of the either the loud world syndrome or the extreme world syndrome, whereby autistic children are experiencing sights and sounds and noises and everything else that are beyond neurotypical's abilities to, and that's why it drives them so crazy, because they're just perceiving so much around them. Their doors of perception are open wider, aren't they?
Yep, absolutely. And it's hard for them to adjust to this world. And that's a theme with a lot of UFO experiencers too. Many of whom are diagnosed with ADHD, OCD, they're kind of given these labels as well, that they are born open to these experiences. They have often speeded up cognition. They have healing abilities. They have telepathic abilities, precognitive abilities. And I again haven't put my shingle out there to invite people. So it's even, to my mind, it's the fact that these people are showing up and kind of spontaneously sharing these experiences makes it even more valid to me, that something along these lines is going on, that we are evolving as a species towards, again, what I term this organic singularity.
How do you think that fits in with Steiner's view of, especially the knowledge of the higher worlds, this sort of super sensible perception, and developing your sensory organs to perceive higher worlds incrementally? How do you think that may fit in? Do you think that potentially some of these people have extra access to these super sensible perceptions?
Well, I definitely think that they have extra access to it, and some of it is because they're neuroatypical. And Steiner talked about how our physical bodies evolve to allow for greater experiences of the super sensory. Supposedly Archangel Gabriel is responsible for the development of the higher brain centers, for instance. And Steiner speculated that we're developing a kind of a new organ that will aid with supersensory abilities, and that's just beginning to develop as part of our physical evolution. So there's kind of a morphological, physical aspect of this too, not surprisingly.
Do you think there's an incarnation currently of Rudolf Steiner in the world? Because that's something that he talks about, that these beings repeatedly incarnate. I mean, he looks a lot like Daniel Day-Lewis, but I don't think it's him.
No, I don't think it's Daniel Day-Lewis. Yeah, the anthroposophical community has their own debates about whether he's incarnated. I personally don't think he has. He did speak about future incarnations where he would be, he would be born into a world where there had been a lot of ecological catastrophes, and most of the world was covered in water, and there was very little food. He didn't speak much beyond that in terms of specifics. He did talk about Ahriman being incarnated around this time. And there's also debate in the anthroposophical community. Has he incarnated already? Is he about to incarnate? In the paper that I sent you, Tony, I also mentioned Lorna Byrne. I don't know if you're familiar with her. She's an Irish mystic.
No.
There's a lot of correspondence between what Lorna Byrne has written. Mark Booth writes a lot about her in Secret History of the World.
Oh, yes, I know Mark. Yeah, well, I'm still very keen to get Mark as a guest on this show at some time in the future.
I think he I won't say discovered Lorna Byrne, but he brought her more attention. And a lot of what she talks about in terms of Satan incarnating, or Ahriman is the name Steiner gave for Satan around this time, to promote materialism, to promote kind of a out of control use of technology, to promote fundamentalism, kind of retrograde nationalism. All the things that we're seeing develop right now are part of a timeline that Steiner talked about and warned about. And supposedly, Ahriman, according to Byrne, Ahriman is already incarnated. There's debate in the anthroposophical community about whether he's actually incarnated or not. So I don't know about Steiner, but
I always find it a fascinating logical conundrum to me that if Ahriman or Satan or whatever we want to call them, the opponents of good, effectively, the negative side of dualism, or the negative side of the idea of God and Satan. And I've never really understood how it is that if I was Satan or Ahriman, I would be the most aware person possibly in the universe of the ultimate power of God. So I'd be aware of, it's like me getting in the ring with Muhammad Ali. I know that I'll never win. Also, I'm aware of the predictions about my own demise and my own ultimate defeat. So you wonder what on earth motivates a being to fight something that is omnipotent, omniscient, in totality. Why would you ever bother to start the war, particularly when you know that you're going to get defeated? So what motivates the Ahriman principle within the world?
Well, yeah, I don't think anyone has a complete answer for that question. But in terms of Steiner's cosmology, these were Lucifer, Ahriman are beings of hindrance. They are used to test humanity, right? To test our free will. Lucifer has gifts in terms of creative abilities. Steiner felt that a lot of artists, musicians, creative types are they have a daemon, which I think you're familiar with that expression, and that's part of what their creativity is about. Ahriman provides gifts of analytical ability and technology, but the key thing is to use technology properly. So, as far as being defeated, Steiner, I guess in some ultimate way, Steiner always believed that good would win out, but he believed that human beings have a choice. We're given a choice, so we can move towards this organic singularity, this sense of community and connection, spiritual development, based on love, based on a human feeling, or we can move towards this emotionless kind of artificial intelligence world where we're connected, but we're connected in a way where we have this automatic intelligence, this extremely well-developed intelligence. But we've lost human feeling. We've lost human connection. There's a lot of UFO literature about how these beings, again, getting back to the elementals and their absence of feeling, and this sense that they're very intrigued with human emotions. there's a whole occult literature on that. And Paul Eno, I think, is another writer that you're familiar with, who gets into the whole idea that there's this parasitic component, to these plasma beings. Traditional term is demons. Steiner called them asauric forces. So in the evolution of the universe, we have these retrograde beings who have been left back in evolution. They have their own agendas. They try to carve out their own territory. It's almost like they're carving out their own fiefdoms. And the Ahriman and Lucifer are attempting to create what Steiner occult is called the eighth sphere. I don't know if you're familiar with that term at all.
No.
Yeah, the eighth sphere is an occult term. There's 7 stages of human development, and the eighth sphere is kind of a bogus creation that is being initiated by these forces of hindrance, where they can pull away some of humanity into this electronic artificial singularity and separate them off from the rest of human evolution. So, in a sense, that they're fighting for their own. What Steiner said was that they were given roles, but they've gone beyond those roles. They've exerted power and influence beyond what they were intended to do. So you do have these sort of moral paradoxes and these paradoxes of, like, why would they do that knowing eventually they cannot win? I don't know. If you look at it at a human level, why do dictators strive for power, knowing that eventually they're going to be overthrown?
Well, I suppose the difference for me would be a dictator is a whole different ball game to taking on the creator of the universe. It's a whole different ball game. Even my analogy of getting in the ring with Muhammad Ali, there is a vague chance in some way or other that I might defeat Muhammad Ali, but to defeat God is impossible. It's not even as if there could be ever a set of circumstances when, if we believe that God is, as I said, omnipotent and omniscient, he literally is in control of everything. So you exist as the adversary purely and simply at the whim of God. God will allow you to continue being his adversary. And of course, then we end up in a real moral dilemma, because we then have the problem of how can an omnipotent, infinitely good God tolerate the existence of any form of evil unless he has in himself supporting the existence of that evil, if that makes sense. I mean, I know these are huge theological problems, and I know they are the role of evil. Is it theophany within theology? Is a profoundly difficult one. But I always found it really difficult to get my head round, because I'm not religious at all. So I find it very interesting to get into the mindset of people whose logical facilities are quite different to my own. In that, so I'm very intrigued at that as to what these entities. And when you're mentioning it there, I was thinking, this is very much parallels with the jinn, isn't it? Within Islamic traditions, the jinn themselves are created, as I said in one of my recent books, the idea that the jinn are made out of, quote, smokeless fire. Now, smokeless fire to me could be analyzed as being plasma, exactly as Paul Eno argues. So there are some very interesting areas here, aren't there? You feel you're tripping on something it's profoundly interesting, I think.
Yeah, I would agree. And I don't think human beings are meant to have, I don't think we have the capacity to completely understand this landscape. That's kind of a bit of a cop-out, but I think it's true. Again, I think free will is crucial to all this. If human beings choose to align themselves with evil, so to speak, or morally backward beings and trap themselves in those worlds, then God is not going to come and save us. That's the whole idea of the eighth sphere, that it's going to kind of split off and go its own way, and that other human beings who don't follow those paths will be able to partake in further evolution. There's also the whole occult esoteric tradition regarding reincarnation and karma. Not all souls, according to Edgar Cayce, according to Steiner, according to various sources, not all souls that exist, that were created by God, so to speak, choose to incarnate at the lower levels or denser levels of existence. They don't choose to come to Earth. They don't choose to come and incarnate in the physical world. So we have unique challenges. Those of us who are courageous enough, I suppose, to incarnate in these realms, we have challenges that other beings don't have. So there's a whole aspect of free will here, that we can choose evil, and God is not going to come in and undo our choice, so to speak. May give us many opportunities to go in a different direction, but that's the best I can make out of it. And again, you're talking about theological questions that I don't think any human being has any definitive answer for. But they are fun. They are fun to speculate about.
I think your point was a very interesting one, that, you know, our intellects themselves, our intellect as whatever we are within the overall hierarchy of things, there are things that we can't possibly understand and motivations we can't understand because we simply do not have the mental facilities to understand. But then the question then comes back to me as to, well, if I don't have the mental intelligence or abilities, why did Edgar Cayce, why did Steiner, what is different about these individuals that allow them to understand in greater detail these things? Are they given extra information from higher levels, and this information, they are then effectively mediums or channels to a greater intelligence that's communicating with us?
Yes, absolutely. Certainly they would say that. I mean, Edgar Cayce is an interesting person. His father was a Freemason. He's also connected to Rosicrucian traditions, although that's not as well documented, obviously, as Steiner. Have you ever read Sidney Kirkpatrick's work on Cayce?
No, I haven't. Tell me more.
It's really wonderful biography. It's by far the best work on Cayce, and he devotes a chapter or two to Cayce's life readings and experiences of connecting with higher beings. Cayce was not just connecting with some Akashic records. That was initially what was presented in There Was a River by Thomas Segru and some of the earlier biographies. They didn't want it to get out, so to speak, because they didn't want to be criticized or thought to be, I guess, a bit too crazy when they talked about, communication with Archangel Michael or some of the other archangels. There's a lot of correspondences between Steiner and Cayce. Archangel Michael is a major figure. You talk about a higher intelligence. He's responsible for, according to old traditions, Archangel Michael is responsible for intelligence and the development of human intelligence, higher intelligence. And he plays a central figure in both Cayce's work and in Steiner's work. So that's kind of an aside, but both of them claim to have been in touch with, through supersensory abilities, higher intelligences.
And the higher intelligences then presumably chose them as well. They have to choose somebody, so why not choose? I always find it quite interesting that they always choose people of a certain sort, whereas to me, if I was going to be a higher intelligence and I wanted to make sure that my message had got across, I'd start taking over political leaders or people that had influence. Because, for instance, with my own understanding of Cayce, I've never understood how Cayce or Cayce's supporters got around the fact that Cayce said that the whole of the western side of the United States would fall into the ocean in 1999, which it didn't. And I find that quite curious as to why people don't see that as a bit of an issue, I suppose, because he did say that, didn't he?
Well, the prophecies, I mean, a criticism of Cayce is certainly that, and there's plenty of so-called prophets out there who seem to be hit or miss. We can attribute that to changes in human free will and changes in timelines. I think that there are various timelines that we can tune into. Cayce's was impressive in terms of his medical readings. When you get into his,
so I hear, yeah,
he's very vague. like a lot of prophets. His writings about Atlantis and things of that nature overlap a lot with Steiner and some of the other occult writers or prophets, but there's no way of verifying them. But Casey, at least to my mind, has some validity. He's worth listening to because the medical readings are pretty remarkable, and if even critics, I have a hard time explaining, some of the healing that he was able to produce.
Were these psychosomatic type healings, or were these actual physiological healings of curing people with incurable cancers and such like, or whatever?
It's a combination of both. And
right.
He talks about, and Casey in the medical literature talks about the role of the mind, talks about psychosomatic aspects. He didn't limit himself just to viewing things from a physical basis. So, yeah, I think that there are beings, there are people who have developed. Sometimes it's accidental. Peter Hurkos, he didn't develop psychic abilities until he fell off a ladder, and he was a Dutch painter, right? So some of these things seem to be almost random. Maybe they're designed in some way, but Steiner was someone who pursued a well-developed, kind of a well-trodden spiritual path, and that's where he claims that a lot of these supersensory abilities developed from. He seems to have been born with some ability, but he definitely developed it in a very systematic way. Casey was more, he kind of discovered his abilities by accident. And he became a kind of medium for these higher beings, and they're apparently pretty benevolent agendas. So yeah, these are you ask good questions. Like, why have some of these prophecies not come true? And again, I think the best explanation is that there are various timelines, that very little is predetermined, that so much has to do with human choice. And even the weather, even geological events that happen or don't happen have to do with human consciousness, that things don't happen in just a mechanical fashion. I think that's an important point.
I suppose my skeptic hat, putting my skeptic hat on, is because they were wrong, full stop, and there isn't, to me, I can't rationalize my way around the fact that if somebody makes a prediction that everybody believes is correct and then it doesn't happen, sorry, that means that they were wrong. And one can fall back on the alternate timelines. But in which case, if there are alternate timelines, what's the validity of any prediction being made? And what is the use of any prediction that's being made? Because presumably the information is given to, and this is, of course, a billion-dollar question, isn't it? And I'm not being difficult here. These are intellectual arguments that I've played around with my own mind for decades.
Yeah, same here.
That if you are shown the future, and if an entity or something gives you information, what do you then do with it? For instance, I give an example of this, which I think was profoundly important, was a few years ago, and I'll be citing this in my new book. There was somebody that contacted me when I was living in Liverpool, a university lecturer in law, and he had regularly had precognitive dreams. And he had a particularly profound precognitive dream where he found himself standing at a window in a hotel. And it was late winter, I think, or he definitely described that he could tell from the conditions what the season was. And I can't remember what season it was now. And he looks out the window, and as he does so, he realizes he's probably in France. And he sees a Concorde go past the window with its tail on fire. And then he sees it crash. But what is even stranger was that after the plane had crashed, he sensed dead people going through him, and they were talking to each other in German. And he heard them saying in his mind, they were saying, "What's just happened? Where are we going? This is just awful. What's just happened?" And he was so concerned about this, because he'd had a series of other precognitions that came true, that he sent a fax to British Airways saying that a Concorde would crash, and he suspected it was probably going to be abroad. And of course, subsequently, we know the Concorde crash at Orly, where the plane crashed, where it hit a hotel and people were killed. But on top of that, the curious thing about this guy's story is that the people who were killed were German. because there were a group of people who the plane had been hired by a German tourist company that were flying them to New York to pick up a cruise that was going from New York. Now, here we have him, desperately trying to stop an incident happening. But of course, then you have the problem that if you succeed in stopping the incident happening, as you say, with alternate timelines, it means that you have actually failed in your prediction because you've done what you were supposed to do, which you stopped that happening. And of course, this is always the problem, isn't it? That how do we use this information? Why is this information being given to us? And indeed, if you have the idea of the Ahriman principle, how do you know that the information you're being given is coming from a good source or a bad source? It's almost like the satanic verses concept, isn't it? In Islam, the idea of how do we know that the source is correct? Interesting area of debate, I think.
Oh, those are always interesting questions. And why was this person, in a sense, chosen to have that experience? Did he tune into some timeline because of some developed faculty that he has, or was that information brought to him? There are, plenty of precognitive visions that have led to changes in timelines, where people have been saved, where people did act on that information.
Well, you mentioned you'd had precognitive experiences yourself earlier on. Could you tell us a little bit about those?
Well, I've had precognitive dreams, and they, I guess they're fairly ordinary. I had a dream the night before Saddam Hussein was captured that he had been captured. I didn't see him with, the scruffy beard where there were, they captured him underground. I saw him in court. It's kind of like a Dunn, a Dunn vision of the future. You're familiar with Dunn, I'm sure.
Very much so. I've written extensively with J.W. Dunn.
Yeah, pretty interesting writer. So it was a vision of him in court making his case in a suit and tie. That's what I saw. So I knew he had been captured, but I didn't see him in that moment. I had another dream, which was a very individual dream. I dreamed of this kind of odd-shaped building in the middle of nowhere and on a farm with all this artwork around it. And a couple of years later, I moved into an office of that description in some semi-rural area of New Jersey. And I love artwork. So there was artwork everywhere on my walls if you come to my office. So it was a precognitive kind of dream about this future event. And a few other dreams. Some of them were very prosaic, just minor things that had happened. I'm a football fan, American football. I saw the last play of the Super Bowl. Too bad I'm not a betting man, because I probably could have made a lot of money on that. But, it's just kind of this flotsam and jetsam that comes through. But some dreams are more numinous than others. I had a dream, and I don't remember a lot of the details, but I was obviously very concerned about what was going on with Ukraine and Putin and all that. And I had a definitive dream on February 22nd. I remember the date because I keep a dream journal, that he would be defeated, that Putin would be defeated. So I'm making a prophecy right now.
That would be wonderful news if that was true. That would be fantastic.
Of course, now, Ukraine is doing very well in the war, and it doesn't seem so strange. But on February 22nd, it seemed pretty unlikely, to say the least. So I can send you a copy of my dream journal if
Very
if you
much
want to
so. And one of the
verify.
things I think is profoundly important is I've had precognitive dreams as well that came true, and I know, and materialist reductionists can shout and scream all they like and say that it's a confirmation bias and the various other nice terminologies they like to use,
All labeling,
to explain them. But I know what I saw, and I know that I dreamt what I subsequently saw, and it's happened on numerous occasions to me. And as you say, sometimes they're profoundly prosaic, and you think, well, what was the point of telling me that? What was the point of me seeing that? And I think it's, as you say, it's Dunn dreams, because the whole point of J.W. Dunn dreams is that they are ordinary, they are everyday, and what they are us back gaining from the future, what J.B. Priestley called future influencing past dreams, whereby we sense something in the future that is part of our own lives that we're not necessarily supposed to change. And it's because we've, as I'd argue in my cheating the ferryman hypothesis, it's because we've lived this life before. And so therefore, there's not at all surprising that our demonic consciousness, which is our consciousness that is effectively remembers all our previous lives, will sometimes leak through in one way or another. It's a very interesting area, this. Sarah, are you interested in coming in on any of these topics? Because we're getting to some quite interesting areas here.
Well, actually, I was researching recently about the Australian concept of the dreaming. And I've never really looked into it that much, but it's a really kind of fascinating concept of this, a kind of consciousness continuum, like life is a story that you can read in the things of the world, and could potentially then have access to.
It's the dream lines, is it? The concept of the dream lines.
The dreaming is the reality of the world, I guess.
Ah, right. Yes, it's the Kate Bush album, isn't it, as well?
But it's a really, really fascinating idea, and I think that the First Nations of Australia are actually a great culture to look at when you think about the very beginnings of culture, because they had an amazing knowledge of their stars, and this idea that the stars know the future, I think, is something that plays out in all subsequent mythologies and ideologies and philosophies in subsequent cultural systems. And if you look at that, like they've discovered by looking at DNA that the people in Australia, the first people to reach it, came from a single wave of people that left Africa 75,000 years ago, and that they potentially had like really well-developed star lore even there. This idea that astrology and astronomy were developed in the Near East is kind of crazy, because one of the amazing things I read was an Australian anthropologist, I can't remember what his name, had said that the people that he met in the desert knew all of the stars in their night sky down to stars of the 4th magnitude, and there was barely any that didn't have a myth or story related to them. And you think about the depth and the understanding of that, and it makes complete sense, because now they're discovering that all of so many of megalithic monuments are star calendars, and they know Stonehenge was used for that purpose. So that knowledge has been part of our history for such a long time. And I actually think that is the basis of all of our myths, come from this idea that the stars are conscious and they influence the earth and all the people and animals on it. And to have those, it would make so much sense as well, because obviously those calendars were created for hunter-gatherers to know where to go to get what at what time. So they had a very pragmatic purpose in the beginning. And then they later on develop into more kind of ideas about the divine and the ideas about conscious star gods, I guess. And, I just think it's really, really fascinating, because of course the stars were actively predicting the future, because they were telling people when fish would run, or when a particular migration would happen with certain animals, or when certain plants would blossom, or when it's a good time to collect other food sources. So absolutely, the stars could be seen on a very, very sort of sensible level to predict the future. And I think it's only natural that transferred into other areas of life as well, and that there's some truth to that as well. I think so many people that I meet are like, oh, astrology, that's ridiculous. But actually, there are ways of predicting the future. And the fact that our ancient ancestors used star calendars to do that is like an incredible like depth of knowledge that we can't comprehend, I don't.
Well, I think that's what you were saying earlier, weren't you? You were saying your initial interest in the old ancient astronauts idea. Or not necessarily the ancient astronauts, which is quite simplistic, but the idea that there are earlier civilizations that we have been seeded in some way in terms of our information or whatever. Because that'd be another area to just consider for a few moments and discuss that.
Yeah, I think that one contribution of the ancient alien literature, although it's very reductionistic, is discovering these old traditions. Rediscovering these old traditions. Cult traditions have known about them for a long time. I mean, Steiner talked about how the original astrology was much more advanced than the sort of the popular astrology that we have now, and spoke to the interconnection of all beings. Just like, well, he believed the Earth was a living entity, it was a conscious entity, long before the Gaia hypothesis was became popular, and that's part of a cult tradition. All the planets are conscious beings. Each of us has a star, according to Steiner. Each of us has a physical manifestation in the universe, in the vast universe. But there's this interconnectedness between different beings and their roles in developing human beings. Steiner talked about how after we die, we initially go to the moon. We are enveloped in this kind of moon consciousness. Later, we go to the sun and different planets, and our karma is kind of reworked. Our organs are developed. It's kind of interesting, the shamanic tradition, when you're initiated, your organs are ripped out and then reproduced. That's, according to Steiner, what happens between death and rebirth. But it's a slower process. So you have this interaction with these higher spiritual beings that help shape mankind. So they help us predict things. We can contact them for information, knowledge, but they also shape our evolution. They work with our karma to develop in terms of reincarnation, develop a plan for your next life. And some people consider reincarnation a trap. That's a theory out there that there's these negative forces or demiurgic forces that are kind of trapping us on Earth and forcing us to reincarnate. I mean, Steiner believed that there was choice involved, and that the purpose of reincarnation was to spiritualize matter. So the beings who've deigned to incarnate in the denser material realms can eventually spiritualize matter, so that we no longer have illness, we no longer have disease, we are immortal, but not because we've connected to machine technology to keep us alive, not because we put our consciousness into computer, but because we've spiritualized matter to a degree. So that's, again, I went off on a little bit of a tangent there, but I think that's an important point to make in terms of Steiner's view that we have a choice. We can move towards more of the Ahrimanic investment in technology and artificial enhancement, superintelligence, automatic consciousness, or we can move towards reconnecting with older spiritual traditions of meditation, of prayer, of a connection with nature that result in this kind of organic singularity. Now, am I making sense here, or is this
No, very much so. I mean, it's very important to appreciate what he taught. I mean, in many ways, I'm reminded here of the writings of Teilhard de Chardin and his concept of the omega point. And the idea that, that evolution is teleological and it has an end purpose. And the end purpose is for us to change. And we are on an evolutionary path towards change. And clearly, as a paleontologist, this is the approach that Teilhard de Chardin would have taken. My position is always, my starting point is always the science. And if it makes scientific sense to me, and if I can find a scientific process that can support an esoteric belief of any description, I think that there's validity there, because that we are at the very first understandings of exactly what science is and what the universe is. And I sometimes feel that modern science is suffering from profound hubris, in that it thinks it understands what is going on, when it is self-evident from the fact that 94% of the universe is missing, and it's dark energy and dark matter. And of course, they call it dark energy and dark matter because we don't know what it is, not because it's dark. So therefore, clearly the universe is a far more complex and far more interesting place than the materialist reductionist science would lead us to believe it is. And in which case, I would say that if it is the argument that the basis of everything is, and it is very much being shown these days with the recent development that that the fifth element, the fifth form of physical matter is now decided to be information. And there's a recent development about this. Now, we know that information is effectively kind of non-physical, which is starting to lead us back to the idea that everything that is, in fact, is based upon information. And of course, information is useless unless you've got something to perceive that information. Information in itself, mathematical structures are of no use whatsoever unless there's an intelligence that can interpret those mathematical structures and manipulate them. So we are coming back to the idea that consciousness is prime, which is, of course, what the esoteric traditions have been teaching for generations, isn't it? They've always argued that as again Teilhard de Chardin said, we are a spiritual being having a physical life.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what Steiner was arguing. And I always feel that, rather similar to the scientists these days, the same goes for the spiritual teachers. They're in the same position. They're trying to interpret the information they are being given from the knowledge bases and the understanding of the universe we have from our civilization. And it was a point we made earlier, wasn't it? The idea that, we don't understand fully what this is. And it's because we are learning and our teachers are learning in exactly the same way, isn't it? That, so you can criticize. And I mean, I was criticizing Casey earlier on, but I think there are elements of truth in all of these great teachers, and they're desperately trying to get across something that they're being told, that their brains are trying to accommodate in a language that that human beings can understand. But we are limited by our language. We are limited by our abilities to understand things. And I think this makes our period a very exciting one. And I think, your interest in UFOs, and I think I'd like to move on to that subject now, the idea of the linkage you're making between Steiner, UFOs, and everything else. So could we zoom in on that a bit and tell us a little bit about this?
Well, I think I already talked about the elementals, right? And Steiner, we talk about the ancient alien traditions, and there seems to be a few star systems that are always mentioned: the Pleiades, Sirius, Orion, and a few others. Steiner believed that there were advanced beings from Pleiades that, or from that area of the universe, that were interacting with us now and trying to support our evolution in a benevolent way. So there's a direct tie in there with some of the star traditions, some of the ancient alien lore. There's the role of elementals. There seems to be some archetypal gray that is incarnated or born into various star systems, various planets, maybe other dimensions. That seems to be ubiquitous, and I think that's a clear tie-in between the UFO phenomena and esoteric literature. The other aspect of this is the hybridization. I'm sure you're familiar with Jacobs and Hopkins talking about the hybridization, the idea that aliens are going to take over the world. Steiner, part of one of the negative timelines that Steiner talked about is that if we don't choose the other path, that at least a portion of humanity will be forced to live with what he called ant beings. And these would be physical beings that would occupy the earth with mankind. And he described them as a cross between the plant and mineral, supremely intelligent, connected to this kind of automatic intelligence network, but without human emotion. So Steiner was alluding to something similar to the hybridization theories of Hopkins and Jacobs, which I find intriguing. Also ties in with the whole Hopi idea of having lived underground with ant people, which you may be familiar with. So there's a literature that the Hopi have a tradition that there have been various disasters that have fire and flood and so forth that have killed off civilizations. And at one point, the original Hopi lived underground with what they called ant people. The description of ant people fits the description of grays. Mechanical, kind of grayish white with large heads and big eyes. And you're familiar with all the drawings that exist around the world of grays. So that's another kind of fascinating tie-in, and that Steiner was alluding to this hybridization. And the transhumanism kind of plays into that. This idea that we're, if so-called evil forces, get their way, that we're going to be, our evolution towards spiritual beings is going to be stopped, at least for some of us, and we're going to be forced to live in this, artificial world, this kind of eighth sphere. The eighth sphere is a concept you might want to look into as far as esoteric, if you're interested in that kind of esoteric literature.
No, I'll follow up on that, because one of the things that has always, again, intrigued me about UFO lore and such like is the seemingly pointless behaviors that the aliens do. I mean, I've never understood, for instance, how many operations do they need to do on people in order to understand how the human body works, when we are supposedly nowhere near as advanced as they are. And yet we've got fMRI scans, and we've got various ways of knowing what's inside the human body without having to do operations on people. And it seems that not only that, but they've been doing it for the last 50 years, and they don't seem to have advanced anyway, which means to suggest to me that there's something much deeper in terms of this evisceration. And you intimated on this earlier on, the idea that it is similar to shamanic law, where you get dismembered shamanically to be remembered again and pulled together again to be reborn. And I think that's something very important here, that there's a linkage that, and again, we have friends, Sarah and I have friends who are part of formal experimentations with dimethyltryptamine. And of course, the aliens or the non-human entities that are encountered in DMT experiences, the mantids come up there. So it's again, are these archetypes, or are they something that really is directly independent of us, that seems to have motivations that are different to us? And the evidence seems to be that, yes, they have independence of it. They're very much linked with our imagination. But, you know, it was a term you used earlier on, the term tulpa, and the idea that we can in some way create beings from our own anticipations of what they are going to be. And that they will use our psychological models, using plasma possibly, to embody themselves in a way that we expect them to be, which then could explain why it is that this cultural tracking mystery, you know, from the 1890s with the airships, traveling on through, it seems that they always seem to be culturally trapping. You know, in the 1890s, they were Europeans that were in airships. And then, you know, we then had the Nordics in, you know, the early 1950s, which then changed to the kind of the more monstrous, the Hopkinsville goblins and the Flatwood monster. And then we moved into the ethos of the Greys. And, you know, I know people turn around and say, of course, the image of the Grey was the original Whitley Strieber image from his book cover, but we know that the alien image, that was way earlier than that. And we know from paintings from the caves, we know that aliens of some description, people were in their minds. Now, could this again be stimulated in some way by electromagnetic fields? Could it be that, you know, our brains get affected by running water? There are various areas here that need to be pursued, because people have these experiences, don't they? You know, these people are not making these things up. You know, why would you make something up like this? You know, I'm reminded, for instance, of the most ridiculous story of the guy that was given pancakes by the aliens, and they took him out in space, and the dog smelt. So the aliens put the dog outside the spaceship. And of course, the dog was frizzled because it was outside of the spaceship. And the same, you know, the idea of the aliens announce they come from the Pleiades, or they announce that they're coming from Sirius. But the Pleiades and Sirius, it is physically, there is no known scientific process whereby beings could travel from the Pleiades to us. You know, and Orion's belt, you know, people coming from Orion's belt. Well, the 3 stars in Orion's belt, just because they're in a line, that's only because it's an optical illusion from where we are located. You know, these stars are nowhere near each other. So clearly there's some kind of tying in to our expectations of what they want us to be. And I think this goes back to the Aggregorial and the idea that, like the jinn made out of smokeless fire, they are using us to pull themselves into this world in some way. And they will present themselves in whatever way they feel that will be to their advantage, and whatever that advantage may be. Sarah, have you got any thoughts on that and things?
Well, one thing I would say is that there definitely is a long tradition of associating certain particular gods with particular star systems. So I do think that that's a lineage that goes on into modern times as well. The other thing that I'm really interested in is the perception of self that ancient people had, where they didn't have reflective surfaces, they didn't have mirrors. And it's something I'm really fascinated in, that actually I think a lot of cave paintings and a lot of these so-called alien images are to do with a different perception of self and a different perception of scale based upon what attention you give to things. So aliens that look like ants may actually just be disproportionately represented because the attention is such that you're looking at it close up and therefore you're seeing it in a different way. One thing I've noticed in dreams is that small things like insects and birds are really big because my attention is what gives them their scale. So instead of me looking close up at something, I'll see a big magpie or a big ant and I'll see it as a big thing. The other thing, talking about perception of self, is this idea of self-image is massive, and it's hard for us to disentangle our consciousness from just how ever-present our image of self now is. And that actually ancient perception of self and other might have been more eye-orientated, actually. So these representations of people having massive eyes might just have been that that's the way that people looked at one another. And the reflective surface thing is fascinating to me. Like, the glass delusion was a condition that was developed once wealthy people started to have windows and glass in their homes. And King Charles of France was supposed to have the glass delusion, and it meant that he thought it was going to shatter at any moment. So I think when we have these reflective surfaces, and now we have these digital devices that represent an image of ourselves as well, there's fragmentation of self that basically makes people feel like they're going mad, which is, I think, something that plays into things like you were mentioning, those certain things like ADHD, autism. Essentially, they're incredibly sensitive people that are just, their brains are so open up to taking all of this information in simultaneously that it is enough to make anyone go mad. This idea of like self-representation and seeing yourself in a reflective surface is something that is relatively modern. And we have a very strong sense of what we look like, as an individual. And I think that also probably contributed to a move away from this kind of communal collective consciousness of a group to more of an ego identifying, self-identification consciousness that would have really changed our perception of the world.
That is absolutely fascinating and something I'd not thought of before. I'm reminded when you were speaking there of a short story I read when I was a teenager, early teenager, by the Japanese writer Edgar Allan Poe. And there is a deliberate reason why he sounds like Edgar Allan Poe, because that's what he called himself as a Japanese version. So it's Edgar Allan Poe. And it was called The Hell of Mirrors. And it was the idea of somebody being locked in a room with mirrors everywhere. And again, how disturbing that would be. And you're quite right. There would have been civilizations that would never have had reflective surfaces, and not very powerful reflective surfaces. So we would have no sense of self. Because I thought that you were going to go down the route of your namesake, Julian Janes, without a Y, of course. Without a why or a wherefore, and the idea of the concept of self, and the idea of the voices in the head, and the idea that, I've got no way of knowing whether the voices in my head are the voices of the gods, because I have no sense of self. Whereas now we do have the sense of self, but is that an illusion in exactly the same way as anything else is? Because we see the world from the location behind our eyes, and we think we are existing, about 6 or 7 inches behind our eyes, because that's where we see the world from.
Probably an element where we over-identify with that reflection of self and that projection of self, rather than an embodied experience of self living in the moment. One of the other things that I find really fascinating is, EMDR, that therapy that uses eye movements to process trauma. Apparently a very effective method of relieving traumatic and traumatic emotional memories. And I find it, Hello? Can you still hear me?
We can still hear you. Yeah.
Yep.
That was exciting.
My battery, I thought my battery just ran out, but it just went all dark.
The Archons didn't like what you were saying, Sarah.
Well, I was just talking about EMDR and about how
Darn.
And now she has gone. The Archons now have got her.
Yep.
As a professional psychologist, the things we're talking about must be areas that interest you all the time and involve you in your work, I guess.
Well, yeah, they tie in with my work, but also, you know, a variety of other interests. I mean, EMDR is something I work with. I'm interested in the point that she was about to make about it. But yeah, Julian Janes's work is something I studied in college. I actually met him. He was a mentor of.
Yeah, mention this. Tell me more. You met Janes. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah, we just went out to dinner and I asked him some questions about his book, and it was very informal. It was very nice man, very sweet man, terrific writer. He writes like in a 19th century style, which I really love. But his theory has a lot of implications. Now, he was a materialist. He was a historian of psychology and experimental psychologist. He thought that any speculation that the gods were real in some sense was ontological nonsense, as he put it. So, you know, but his theory has pretty wide applications. And Steiner and again other occultists talk about how we're evolving from being controlled to a great degree by the gods, that the bicameral voices were actual, you know, gods, to having a separate ego. And we've gone too far in that direction. We've become too involved in materialism, too involved. Sorry.
About to lose you as well.
Yeah, well, this is just a power issue.
Obviously, the Archons do not like Julian Janes for some reason.
Well, I plugged my phone in, so we should be good. But it's interesting because Janes believed that schizophrenia was a vestige of the bicameral mind. And Gurdjieff talks about how when the Kunda buffer was removed, when there was some sort of change to our neurology that was directed by the gods, that hypnosis and schizophrenia were vestiges of the bicameral mind. A fascinating thing in my research. If you read All and Everything, there's a lot of allusions to Gurdjieff's work as a hypnotist, and you know, his belief that hypnosis and schizophrenia are vestiges of an older consciousness. So this whole idea of this paleontology of consciousness is pretty fascinating. And you know, Steiner's view and a lot of the esoteric views are very much in line with Janes. As far as the other question that you were talking about, I mean, are these being shapeshifters? Do they just appear to us the way we want to see them? There's definitely an element of that. And I mean, that takes us back to John Keel and the ultra-terrestrials. But there's also the role of DNA. I think that these are physical beings that have the ability to shapeshift. And that's very different than saying that they have no identity, that they have no physical presence, and that they just merely appear to us in whatever form that they want to. And I think there's different levels of that. I think there's different levels of immersion in matter. So I think, for instance, when we're out of this body, between, you know, after we die, and you know, our soul, our astral body, whatever terminology you want to use, goes on, we're no longer embodied, but we still have a consciousness. So is that some subtle form of matter that doesn't involve DNA, or is it not involved at all in what we call matter? I mean, those are interesting questions, but I tend to believe that there's a physical reality to a lot of these beings. I do believe some of these beings can shapeshift. They can appear to us the way they want us to see them. And where the line is between that, I don't completely understand. Again, there's a lot of overlap with shamanic literature and the UFO phenomena. For instance, owls are a shamanic totem. They appear in a lot of UFO experiencer literature. And a lot of psychologists, hypnotists, and theorists say, well, that's just a screen memory. There's actually some sort of alien being there. They're just trying to appear to us as an owl. Well, I don't believe that, because the owl has been a totem in shamanic and Rosicrucian traditions. The owl is a symbol of wisdom. It's a symbol of initiation. So that is fascinating to me, that this owl figure appears often in UFO experiencer literature.
Yeah, that's a very interesting one, isn't it? The whole concept of the owls and the way the owls play. And I know that, is it writers like Nick Redfern have written extensively about this. And also, I can't remember the writer now, but one of the writers in the 1960s that was particularly interested in the role of rabbits within the overall phenomenon, you know. So it seems here that, was it, you called it leporology or something, I think it was. I can't think of the writer now. He's very, very famous.
I know what you mean. Yeah.
And the idea is, isn't it, that, you know, that it seems that the phenomenon is just far more interesting than the simplistic model that a lot of people see it as being, you know. And you as a psychologist, you know, you're aware of how the brain works and how we can see you know, we are fooled by optical illusions, how hypnotism can work, how we can hypnotize people to avoid blind sight, you know. So there's lots of things here that we seem to be being manipulated, or we are knowingly being manipulated ourselves. And this is why I think you're quite right in the idea that esoteric traditions have known this for a long time. You know, there is nothing new here, you know, in the terms of, you know, an earlier point you made about, you know, the creation of egregores via magical tradition, you know, and the idea of you can use them as servitors and you can use them at your beck and will. And of course, the danger is that once you create them, they may take on independence of yourself as well, you know. And so there's a lot of areas here that we are just touching upon. And I think this is why this conversation has been utterly fascinating. And I'm so delighted that you contacted me on this, because, you know, being able to sound out these ideas and what they really mean, you know, that's the ultimate search, isn't it? A search for meaning. It's the search for genuine understanding. And I think we both agree that people do have extraordinary experiences. And the question is, what are these extraordinary experiences? So in your many years of reading and research, oh yeah, there was somebody else I wanted to mention as well, is that I in my limited knowledge of Steiner, I'm always reminded of Swedenborg. Were there parallels was Steiner ever interested in the work of Swedenborg?
Yeah, there are definitely parallels. Steiner felt that Swedenborg took an Eastern, more of a left-handed path towards developing supersensory abilities. That was based on, you know, the sexual yoga of, you know, later became famous with Crowley. That was Steiner's take on it. So he felt that Swedenborg was kind of tainted in that way, but that he had real abilities to see into the supersensory world. You know, Swedenborg, you have you know, the same issues around a blend of insight and precognitive ability with what seems to be total nonsense, right? And you run into that with all of these people to some degree. So it's hard to differentiate between when their own psyches are distorting things, when they're being given false information. The one thing that Steiner and Swedenborg and all the occultists agree, that there is you have to be cautious in terms of the information that you get. And this is, you know, ufologists like Keel talked about this too, that there is an intelligence behind the UFO phenomena, at least parts of the UFO phenomena, that has a kind of trickster component, or maybe the demonic component, you know, where there's a lot of false information being given. Steiner was very skeptical of spiritualism, very skeptical of any medium that lost consciousness and was, in a sense, possessed by some other intelligence. And we see a literature full of, you know, mediums who make all sorts of claims, and they seem to have ability, and they sort of kind of hook people into believing in them because they can predict things, they can see things, but then it's mixed in with all this other nonsense. And Swedenborg and Steiner both warned that you have to be very careful about the information that you're getting from the supersensory realms, because you have these capacity to lie. You have these sort of trickster figures out there.
Well, it's like the idea, isn't it? The hungry ghost, the Joe Fisher idea, you know, that there seems to be a trickster element that seems to deliberately go out of its way to cause problems to people. Now, one could again be cynical and turn around and say there is no trickster element. These individuals are just making it up as they go along. And therefore, there will be times when they will have completely wrong information, because that's the nature of the beast. But as you rightly say, you know, most of the great mediums did have hits, uncanny hits that were much greater than just by sheer chance and guesswork. So either they were very good cold readers, or they were given information very cleverly, or it seemed that sometimes they could do it and sometimes they could not. And of course, I always feel very sorry for mediums such, you know, when they become very famous, because they're expected to then do it on demand. And of course, anybody, you know, if you just have, and I'm of the opinion that an awful lot of this is a word you used earlier on, you know, it's hypnagogic imagery, and individuals under certain circumstances, hypnagogic imagery comes to them and they get a message hypnagogically, but they can't control it. It comes to them spontaneously. But when it does, they have an ability to either see the future or whatever we'd like to describe it. But when they become famous, they've got to do it all the time. And they're going to be desperate because it's their living. And it's easy to criticize, isn't it? It's easy to turn around and say, you know, they're con merchants and everything else. And I'm the first one to say that. But if I'm reasonable about it, you know, it's your living, you know, it's your reputation. And you need to survive, you need to feed your children, the various other things. But it doesn't invalidate the fact that they do have these skills, you know. And, you know, I've seen it myself. I was at on 2 or 3 occasions I've been involved in an event at the Arthur Findlay College in Essex, where they train mediums. And I was there with a good friend of mine, and who's been a guest on this show earlier on, Susan Laybourne, who is a genuine medium and is as cynical and as skeptical as I am about a lot of the things around us, but she has uncanny skills. And she got me up, and there was an audience of trainee mediums there. And she got me up and she said, let's see if you have mediumistic skills. And I said, nonsense, I just don't have any of those skills. And she said, okay. And she just got me to go into a particular state of thought. And she said, so what are you perceiving? And I had an hypnagogic image that just flashed into my mind. And it was a woman standing in a kitchen. And the doors of the kitchen units had been taken off. So the kind of carcasses all around the kitchen. And she's talking to a young girl. And this was absolutely vivid. It was like the hypnagogic imagery just as you wake up, or just when you go to sleep, or the hypnopompic imagery when you wake up. But it was vivid, and it was like a flash in front of my visual imagery. And I just said to the audience, I've just seen a woman arguing with a young girl, and they're in a kitchen, and I described the kitchen. And there was a lady in the audience that stood up and said, and there was witnesses to this, you know, about 100 people in the room. And she stood up and she said, this is uncanny. She said, I'm a school teacher. And before I came to this conference, this weekend conference, I'd been talking to one of my A-level students about what university she was going to go to. And she came around to my house and she was saying she wanted to go to one university. And I was suggesting another. And she said, but you saw that. But what is even stranger is that the reason my kitchen is exactly as you described it. Because I knew I was going to be away for the conference, we had people coming in to do my kitchen out. And on Friday, they came in and they took all the doors off the units. Now, that to me is extraordinary. That is inexplicable. That's not just an imagery of seeing somebody or something. It was a precise image that was profoundly unusual. And I know that happened to me. You know, and it's inexplicable, isn't it? You cannot, there is no, was it telepathy? What was it? I don't know. And I've never been able to do that since. I mean, I get powerful hypnagogic images sometimes when I'm reading and everything else as well. But it does seem that the veil gets broken down when we're in a particular mental state and the other world comes through, you know, doesn't it? Yep. I mean, you said you've had precognitive issues. Have you ever had any other experiences similar to that you think, I cannot explain that?
Well, in college, I spontaneously had this experience with a close friend of mine, and we seemed to be kind of neurally connected. connected in some way. We would have telepathic connections, but this particular experience, something told me to look into the eyes of this person, and this panorama opened up behind him, and he described the same thing happening when he was looking at me. Our eyes just locked for some reason, and I had a vision of what I think was a past life with him. And Steiner, I just read a couple of months ago in Steiner how that's when you're an initiate, you have those kinds of experiences all the time. Now, I don't pretend to be an initiate. I don't have these experiences all the time. But I did have this particular experience with this fellow, and we had a couple of other kind of weird psychic connections. A couple of weeks later, I was reading The Center of the Cyclone by John Lilly.
Wow, excellent writing, yes.
What happened is similar to the Sufi eye exercise, where you look into the eyes of another person and you see their faces change. And that's supposedly past lives. So I experimented a little bit with that with, a girlfriend at the time who's now my wife, with other friends, and they would see the same faces on me, and I would feel my body change. So I definitely have mediumistic abilities. I actually have to be kind of careful with that. I don't claim to be psychic per se, but I'm definitely an intuitive. I can pick up on my clients. I'll tell them things, and they'll say, "That's uncanny. I was just thinking that." So when you let go of your ego, you go into, whether it's a formal trance state or just a state of openness, you do pick up on other information because we all are connected. I do think that we're all developing that telepathic kind of connection. Again, I keep using this term, the organic singularity, that I think ideally human beings are heading towards. So we're all starting to develop these abilities. None of us are particularly unique. I think we all have these abilities. It's just a matter of focusing on them and developing them if we want. Some people are born with them. Again, some people have accidents, whether it's a physical illness or epilepsy, or like Kirkos falling off a ladder, where you had a brain injury that tuned us into these other realities. But it's completely silly at this point to dispute that. If you have any sort of intellectual integrity, in my opinion. So it's not a question of do these things exist. As with UFOs, it's a question of what they are and what they mean in terms of our personal evolution. I always bring it back to the individual person and our individual consciousness and our evolution, not to, abstract concepts.
It's a search for meaning, isn't it? That these things, we forget that, symbolism is there, symbolism all the time, within our lives. But, when you were saying, for instance, that, that we're developing something at the moment and we're broadening out. Well, I had a meeting a few years ago with one of the top quantum physicists in the UK at the University of Manchester in the laboratories where they first split the atom, or they discovered, the makeup of the atom and such like. And he just turned around to me over coffee and, as a matter of fact, said, that of course we now know that every electron in the universe knows the location of every other electron. And it's the idea that at a deeper level of reality, everything is single, everything is a unity. It's the work of people like David Bohm and the implicate and explicate orders. And the more and more we're looking into this, the more we're discovering that the universe itself is holographic in nature. And the peculiar things about holograms is each part contains the whole and the whole contains the parts. And of course, this is again esoteric teachings. These are teachings that go down, and the idea of esoteric teaching that we are one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. The idea that you look for the God within, you look for the unity of humanity inside yourself, because you are not a single something. You are in a state of what the Platonists would call amnesis, the idea you've forgotten what you are and you are part of something greater, but you are in this, whatever this is. I call it an instantation in my new book, in a reflection of the model used by Dr. Andrew Gallimore. And the idea that, we are within something that is mind created. And it is created by our minds and surrounds us. And although it is independent of us, we are collectively creating it. And, I'm calling this the Aggregorial hypothesis of reality, that we are all co-creators of an external reality. And of course, this comes right down to even the teachings of people like Berkeley, the idea that, that nature needs observers in order to exist. And of course, we know this from quantum mechanics and quantum physics, the writings of people like John Wheeler, the participatory universe, the idea that there is a direct feedback mechanism. So in which case, if there's a feedback mechanism between mind and matter, it is not at all surprising that under certain circumstances, if time is, as Einstein said, an illusion, but of a particularly strong one, linear time doesn't exist in the way we understand it to be. Time is orthogonal. Time, there's a permanent now. So therefore, being able to see the future and the past, in which case past lives, as I would argue, past lives, when you're remembering past lives, it's because you are everybody. And you're attuning into the greater consciousness, what I call the Überdaimon, the idea of the greater consciousness, the Jungian idea of the collective unconscious, and the idea that we can, under certain circumstances, attune out into that information field, what people would call the Akashic field or the Akashic record. I'd call it the 0 point field from my scientific point of view. But it seems that we can attune into these things, and certain adepts can do so. The question is how they interpret that information. And we can only ever interpret the information by our language and also our own individual belief systems. And if our individual belief systems create in some way the external reality we project outwards, our external experiences will vindicate our own belief systems. So this is why, for instance, I've always been amazed that people that have particular religions see in their world support for their religious beliefs everywhere. And this is because their world is attuned to that. Their world is accommodating that and creating itself to accommodate those anticipations. And could this be is what aliens are doing? Could it be why cultural tracking happens? It's because this is what we are expecting to happen. And again, I'm reminded here in quantum physics, the amount of times that subatomic particles come into existence because we anticipate them. We expect them to be there, and lo and behold, they do. There was one famous statement made by E. Rabi, who was a Nobel Prize winner in physics. And when they discovered the muon, his response was, "Who ordered that?" It's as if they'd ordered a pizza and they'd collectively thought, we need a muon in order, we've got a missing piece in the present model of quantum physics in terms of the particle zoo. We need another one. And lo and behold, it happens. Like they found the Higgs boson in, was it 2017 or whatever, at CERN.
Fascinating.
It is intriguing, isn't it? And I think that by working with mystics, scientists can open up more doors. But at the moment, they're at war with each other. They don't realize that they're looking at the world from just a different way. It's a different mode of understanding, purely and simply. Right, we're getting towards the end now. So, Robert, is there any ways people can contact you or anything about your work and everything else, or your writings and your children's books, for instance, which I'm very intrigued in? Do you want to mention them for a second before we finish? We've got about 5 minutes. So,
sure. Yeah, I've written 2 children's books. One was published. It's called Kiko and the Tree Woman. So you can get that on Amazon. It's a simple picture book, really beautiful illustrations. And it came out of a kind of a numinous dream I had of a Celtic, what I call a Celtic tree woman. It was this one-eyed, well, it's hard to describe. It was a tree that was in the shape of a woman. The branches were her hair, and she had one eye. And it was just a very powerful kind of benevolent feeling that I got from this visage. It was kind of like a dakini. It's like a one-eyed Devic force, but it was Celtic in appearance. So I wrote a children's story around that and published it. That's the only book I've written. I'm starting to write some articles. You could reach me by email. That's at hamletsmill@msn.com. Hamlet's Mill is a book on astroarchaeology, by the way. That's one of my favorite books.
Oh, I was wondering what that was when you sent me the email. Right, okay.
Sarah's probably familiar with that based on some of her interests and what she was talking about. I'm sure she's familiar with Santania's book, Hamlet's Mill. But it's hamletsmill@msn.com. You're free to be friends with me on Facebook. I'll certainly respond to you if you have questions or mutual interests. At some point, I'm probably working towards putting things together in book form. My interests are varied. I don't stay in one silo, so to speak. So it's kind of hard for me to write a book because I'm interested in so many different things. So I would probably have to really focus on one theme and try to put something together. But that's essentially how people can reach me. I don't have a website, and I don't have any major books on these phenomena published as of yet.
Well, Robert, I am sure that if you started thinking about it and started writing, you could write a very, very fascinating book. I mean, this conversation has been really, really interesting. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and a wonderful exchange of ideas and thoughts. Thank you very much. Sorry that we lost Sarah there. Obviously, the Archons decided that whatever Sarah was about to say wasn't allowed to be said. But everybody, thanks for listening to us and watching us here on Facebook. This is also recorded and will be placed on my YouTube channel later on this evening or tomorrow. So thank you very much for listening in. And remember that we try to broadcast every Monday if we have guests available. But please check out the previous shows as well, because we're now building up quite a backlog of information, and effectively the things that are said in each of the interviews can be referred back. For instance, when Robert was going on about autism, for instance, I was reminded of the couple of interviews we've done with Diane Hennessy-Powell, Dr. Diane Hennessy-Powell, and some of the extraordinary work she's doing with autistic children, with precognitive and telepathic autistic children. So check up on them as well. But thanks everybody, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you very much. All the best. Take care.